It begins with silence, not the ordinary quiet of a rural night softened by crickets or the faint sigh of wind across fields, but a silence so dense that it feels purposeful, as if every sound has been plucked away. In that silence the Caraway family sat within their modest home on a hill in the year 1874, their oil lamps glowing weakly against the dark. It was a night like many others until the tick began. At first it was faint, a simple noise, the kind anyone might ignore, yet within seconds its strangeness revealed itself. For Thomas Caraway, a man who spent his life repairing clocks, the direction of the sound was unmistakable. A clock has a rhythm, a forward pulse that matches the measure of human breath, but this was inverted, ticking in a way that unraveled the moment, as if each sound pushed against the natural current of time. The sound came from the mantel where an old silver pocket watch rested. It had belonged to Margaret's father, kept more as a relic than a tool for its hands, no longer held true to any hour. They had left it there for years, lifeless, forgotten, yet now it pulsed with a rhythm that should not exist. Margaret was the first to whisper a prayer. She pressed her fingers together so tightly her knuckles whitened, her eyes fixed upon the small object as though it might leap from its resting place beside her. Their daughter Anna clutched the fabric of her mother's sleeve. The girl was only 12 but understood that this sound was wrong. She had lived her entire life surrounded by the measured order of her father's trade, the comforting tick of countless clocks, but this was different. This was the undoing of comfort. Thomas approached the mantel slowly, each step sounding heavy against the wooden floorboards. He reached out but hesitated, his fingers hovering just above the watch. His breath quickened. For a man of precision, the absurdity of the moment gnawed at him. He could feel, even without touching it, the vibration of its backward rhythm. Samuel, the younger son, barely 9 years old, broke the silence with a question. "Papa, why is it counting wrong?" His voice was unsteady, but the innocence within it cut through the dread. Thomas could not answer. He lowered his hand and stepped back, his gaze fixed upon the impossible motion of the watch hand, spinning backward second by second as though undoing the hours already lived. Outside, the night pressed against the windows, and the Caraway home seemed sealed away from the world, a solitary chamber where time itself had faltered. The family's fear grew not from what might happen but from the unbearable certainty that what they were hearing should never have been possible. Margaret whispered again, her words trembling, "It isn't of God." She pulled Anna close, shielding her, as if the sound itself might strike. The girl buried her face against her mother's shoulder, yet even through the muffling embrace she could not escape the tick. The room seemed to change with each beat. The shadows stretched, lengthening unnaturally. The flame of the lamp guttered and returned as if struggling against a current unseen. The very air felt heavy, thickened by the rhythm of reversal. Every member of the Caraway family knew, though none dared to say it aloud, the watch was not simply moving, it was undoing. Thomas finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "It's broken," he said, though he did not believe it. He was a clockmaker. He knew the difference between malfunction and impossibility. Still, the words were an attempt at order, a desperate reaching for rational ground, yet as he spoke them the watch ticked louder, as if mocking the lie. Samuel's eyes widened. "It's making the room slower." He raised his small hands, moving them in front of his face, convinced the air itself was resisting. Margaret hushed him, though her own eyes betrayed the same realization. The moments felt stretched, pulled like threads, unraveling in reverse. Thomas stepped forward once more, determination etched into his features. He reached for the watch, this time with resolve. His hand closed around it, and for a brief instant the ticking ceased. Relief swept the room like a fragile dawn, but then it returned louder than before, reverberating now through his palm. He dropped it onto the mantel, recoiling as if burned. The watch landed upright, unshaken, still ticking backward. Anna dared to speak. "Maybe it wants us to listen." Her voice was fragile, but her words carried a strange clarity. All eyes turned to her, the child who seemed suddenly older, as though the backwards tick had touched her more deeply than the rest. Thomas shook his head violently, unwilling to grant meaning to something that defied his trade and his sense. The family remained there for what felt like hours, bound together by fear, unable to look away from the object undoing their night. No one thought to leave the room, no one thought to extinguish the lamp or retreat to bed. The ticking filled every thought, stripping them of choice. At last Margaret lifted her gaze upward toward the beams of the ceiling, whispering another prayer. Softer this time she prayed, not for safety but for forgiveness, for she believed in that moment they were trespassing against the natural order, inhabiting minutes that did not belong to them. When the oil in the lamp began to fade, shadows deepened. The family sat frozen in their chairs, unwilling to move as the watch continued its impossible rhythm, and as the night stretched onward the question grew heavier in each of their hearts. If time could move backward, what might it take from them? For when the tick that should not exist found its way into their home, it did not simply mark the hours, it consumed them. To understand the night the watch began its backward song, we must first understand the family who lived beneath its spell. The Carraways of Carraway Hill were not a family born of legend, nor were they seekers of attention. They were quiet people shaped by their land, by hardship, and by a town that tolerated them without fully embracing them. The patriarch Thomas Carraway was a man of tools and patience. His workshop stood at the side of the house, smelling of oil, brass, and sawdust. To Thomas, time was a craft, not a mystery. He believed every hour could be measured, every second pinned down like a specimen. His hands were steady, his eyes sharp, his devotion to the wheelwork of clocks nearly religious in its precision. In the town people respected his trade, though they never sought his company. Thomas was known for fixing what was broken, yet he rarely joined in the idle chatter of neighbors or the laughter at the tavern. He was exact in all things, including his distance. Margaret, his wife, carried a different inheritance. Raised in a house where scripture mingled with superstition, she bore the memory of her mother's warnings: never stop a clock at midnight, never turn a mirror to the wall, never trust the silence of a still night. Where Thomas dismissed these sayings as nonsense, Margaret carried them like stones in her pockets, heavy, unshakable. Her prayers were fervent, her fears sharper than most, and though she loved her husband, she often felt he lived in defiance of forces he could not see. Their children inherited fragments of both worlds. Anna the elder at 12 was watchful and quiet, a girl with her father's careful eye but her mother's sensitivity. She spent long hours in her father's workshop, fascinated by the steady rhythm of pendulums, yet she also listened closely when her mother spoke of spirits and signs. She carried both logic and belief within her, though she had not yet decided which voice she would trust. Samuel, only 9, was restless, mischievous, and often impatient. Where Anna observed Samuel, questioned, he had his father's curiosity without his discipline. He loved to pry open boxes, peek inside drawers, and ask why things could not be otherwise. He was the kind of child who noticed cracks in the world and wanted to widen them. His laughter filled the house, but so too did his endless questions, many of which unsettled Margaret more than they pleased her. The Carraways lived at the crest of Carraway Hill, a rise of land that bore their name not because of prestige but because their home had stood there longer than anyone remembered. The hill was isolated, its slopes tangled with oak and pine, its soil stubborn and rocky. Their house, built of weathered wood, seemed always to stand in defiance of the wind. Some said the hill itself held a shadowed history, old stories of travelers who vanished in its woods, of strange lights seen by shepherds on winter nights. Most in the town dismissed these tales as gossip, but Margaret never did. The town below was small, a cluster of homes, a church steeple, a blacksmith's forge, and a general store. It was a place where everyone knew one another, where rumors carried more quickly than the mail. The Carraways belonged to it, but only at its edges, though mass skills ensured they were never destitute. Yet their name was not spoken with warmth. Some neighbors muttered that Thomas was too proud, too certain of his own craft. Others whispered that Margaret's intensity made them uneasy. To the children of the town, Anna and Samuel were curiosities tolerated at school, excluded at play, yet within their home there was still comfort. Evening meals shared by lamplight, Anna reading aloud while her father tinkered with gears, Samuel playing outside, until Margaret's stern voice called him in. Theirs was a household of contrasts, reason and ritual, gears and prayers, laughter and shadows. They were not wealthy, but they had each other and the rhythm of their lives. Until the watch began its reverse ticking, seemed secure, but cracks were already present. Thomas, though precise, was often burdened by debts of work. Clocks and watches brought to him were not always repaired quickly, and whispers spread that his patience bordered on obsession. Margaret grew increasingly uneasy in the house on the hill, complaining of drafts that carried no wind, of nights where the silence pressed too heavily against her chest. Anna sometimes woke with dreams of hours repeating. Samuel once asked his mother if days could play backwards, an innocent question that unsettled her so deeply she struck him across the cheek. The hill itself seemed complicit on storm nights. Lightning lingered longer over Carraway Hill, branching across the sky as though reluctant to leave in. Autumn mist clung thickest around the family's property, muffling footsteps, turning the house into a ghostly silhouette above the town. The villagers glanced upward when they saw it, then quickly looked away. If the Carraways had enemies, they were not declared yet. If they had friends, none were close. Their life was one of quiet endurance, each day folding into the next, each year marked by the steady aging of wood, the fading of fabric, the slow climb of vines along their fence. This was the family into whose hands the watch returned, a family neither wicked nor saintly, neither chosen nor cursed, simply a family balanced precariously between faith and reason, suspicion and precision, belief and denial. And when the watch awoke, when its hands began to spin against the flow of time itself, it did not fall into a household prepared to face the impossible. It fell into a house already divided, a family already carrying fault lines, and a hill already burdened with stories best left untold. The watch's backward ticking did not come without warning. Weeks before the night it startled the Caraway family into dread. The house on the hill had already begun to breathe with unease. The signs were not violent nor even obvious at first, but they crept into daily life like whispers carried through a closed door, subtle, insistent, impossible to ignore. Once noticed, it began in Thomas' workshop. The space was his sanctuary, a narrow room lined with shelves that held clocks in every stage of repair. Pendulums swayed, gears clicked, tiny screws glinted beneath lamplight. To Thomas, order lived here, but in late autumn he began to notice small betrayals. A tool he swore he had laid upon the bench was discovered on the opposite shelf. A watch he had polished to brilliance dulled overnight, its brass face tarnished with a film that no cloth could remove. One morning he found a half-built clock ticking, though no mainspring had yet been fitted. The sound stopped the moment he touched it, leaving him staring at lifeless parts. Margaret noticed the hallway first. On nights when the wind was still she heard the faint tick of a clock that did not exist. Sometimes it came from above, sometimes below, sometimes just over her shoulder. She would turn expecting to see one of Thomas' creations misplaced on a shelf or sill, but there was never anything there. She prayed against it, whispered verses under her breath, and told herself she was imagining things. Yet when she asked Anna if she ever heard it, the girl nodded quietly as though afraid to admit too much. Anna's dreams began soon after she woke, with images etched behind her eyes. The silver pocket watch spinning backward in the dark, its hands pulling her through corridors of her own house that stretched endlessly, rooms folding into themselves like pages turned too quickly. She told no one at first, ashamed of her fear, but the visions clung to her, making her watch her father's work with new suspicion, as if each gear he fitted might conjure the dream. Once more Samuel was less haunted, yet more vocal. The boy had a way of speaking truths no one wanted to hear. At supper one evening he announced that he had seen the morning come twice. He described waking early, watching his mother light the stove, then returning to bed only to wake again to the same motions repeated. Margaret scolded him sharply for speaking nonsense, but his insistence rattled her. Later, when he whispered to Anna that some days felt shorter, like the hours were slipping away too fast, she did not laugh. For Thomas the strangest moment came late one evening when he wound a clock he had built himself years earlier. The mechanism resisted him, its gears grinding against the key as though refusing the forward pull. Then suddenly the pendulum swung not outward but inward, reversing its natural sway. The motion lasted only seconds, but it froze him in place. He dismantled the clock that night, scattering its pieces across his workbench, yet even then he swore he could hear a faint tick. Though no assembled movement remained, the family spoke little of these things to one another. Each clung to silence, hoping their own unease was isolated. Margaret turned to prayer more fervently. Thomas buried himself deeper in his workshop. Anna wrote fragments of her dreams in a small notebook hidden beneath her mattress. Samuel, restless and curious, continued to prod, asking questions that made everyone flinch. What if clocks go the wrong way sometimes? What if time doesn't like us anymore? The unease seeped beyond the Caraway home when Mrs. Langford, their neighbor, visited with a basket of bread. She paused in the doorway and frowned. "Your house feels strange," she muttered, unable to explain. She claimed she heard a faint rhythm as she left, though no clock sat in the front hall. Thomas dismissed it sharply, but Margaret's face tightened. Even the animals seemed disturbed. The family's old dog, a patient creature that rarely barked, began to growl at the mantel where the broken watch lay. At night he would sit in the hallway, ears pricked, eyes fixed on nothing, as if listening to something the family could not hear. The chickens down the hill laid fewer eggs, often at odd hours, their patterns broken. Small signs, subtle but undeniable, eroded the Caraway's sense of ordinary life, and so the weeks crept on. Each day carried the appearance of normalcy, yet each night ended with the same unsettled silence, the same faint whispers in the gears. Thomas kept repairing clocks, but his hands trembled more than before. Margaret prayed, but her prayers began to sound like bargains. Anna dreamed, her notebook filling with sketches of watch faces without numbers. Samuel watched the days, convinced they were bending around him like reeds in a river. No one yet said aloud what each of them felt in their bones, that something had shifted not only within the house but within the very flow of time. They did not need the watch to tick in reverse to know their world was slipping. They already lived in the shadow of its coming. In a town as small as Caraway, silence itself is enough to stir suspicion. The Caraway family did not intend to draw attention, but the strange currents within their home could not remain hidden. The whispers began not in their own voices but in the mouths of neighbors, those who looked upward toward the hill and wondered why the air around that house seemed heavier than it should be. Mrs. Langford, who lived closest, was the first to speak aloud of what she noticed returning from evening errands. She often passed the base of the hill. One autumn night she paused, shifting the weight of her basket, and heard it, a faint ticking carried through the still air. At first she dismissed it, imagining it was one of Thomas' many clocks drifting from an open window, but when she returned the next night and the night after, the sound remained. It was not steady like an ordinary clock. It faltered, rushed, and stumbled like footsteps retracing themselves. She told her sister who told her husband, and soon the blacksmith. Mr. Yates heard of it. He admitted that he too had seen Thomas standing motionless in his workshop staring at a dismantled watch for what seemed like hours, lips moving silently as if in prayer or calculation. Yates said he greeted him once, but Thomas did not stir, as though caught in another rhythm entirely. Children were the quickest to invent stories, they said. Anna walked through the schoolyard with her head tilted, listening to sounds no one else heard. They teased Samuel, calling him yesterday's boy, claiming he lived in a different day than the rest of them. Though the taunts were cruel, they carried the uneasy echo of what many adults whispered privately, that the Caraway children were touched by something beyond understanding. The gossip spread across tavern tables and church pews. Some claimed Thomas had built a clock that could count years instead of hours, and that the strain of such a thing had broken him. Others accused Margaret of sorcery disguised as prayer, her intense devotion masking darker practices. The stories shifted with each telling, yet always returned to the same point: the Caraway family was no longer entirely one of them. For the Caraways, the weight of this suspicion pressed heavily. Margaret avoided the market, sending Anna in her place. The girl returned with reddened eyes, carrying bread that had been set down with visible reluctance. Samuel was pushed from games in the square, left to linger at the edges. Thomas kept to his workshop, hammering and filing with more force than necessary, as though he could drown out the town's whispers with the clang of metal. Yet the more they tried to shrink away, the sharper the attention grew. Mrs. Langford swore that when she passed the Caraway home she saw shadows in the windows moving opposite the light, silhouettes that retreated when they should have advanced. Mr. Yates told of a night when his own clock shop seemed to falter, every pendulum swinging slower, until he stepped outside only to see a faint light glowing on the hill. He swore the air felt thick, as if minutes themselves were heavier near the Caraway home. These accounts wove themselves into folklore before the family even knew. By the end of the year, villagers spoke of Caraway Hill as a place where time-staggered travelers avoided the path that passed too close. Mothers pulled children inside before dusk, muttering that darkness arrived quicker when one faced the house on the rise. The hill became a boundary not forbidden but quietly shunned inside the family's home. The effect was suffocating. Margaret prayed more, her voice carrying through thin walls so that passers-by claimed to hear her at odd hours. Anna grew quieter, shrinking from the stares that followed her in town. Samuel grew louder, almost defiant, mocking the children who mocked him, yet retreating to his room to scratch drawings of clocks onto scrap paper. Thomas refused to acknowledge any of it, yet his silence was a shield too fragile to hold. What frightened the family most was not the gossip itself, but the way it fed the mystery. The more the town whispered, the more each member of the family doubted their own senses. When Margaret heard the phantom ticking, she wondered if it was merely fear planted by neighbors. When Anna dreamed of reversed hours, she asked if it was her own imagination trying to match the stories. Even Thomas, stubborn as he was, felt his certainty erode. Could the villagers truly sense what his family endured, or were they shaping it into something worse than it was? The truth remained that the Caraways were already slipping into isolation. Invitations ceased, doors closed more quickly when they passed what had once been a simple hilltop home now loomed in the town's mind as something unnatural. The silence around the family was no longer accidental, it was deliberate, sharpened into a blade. In the weeks to come that silence would become unbearable. It would not simply haunt the Caraways within their home, it would define them, cut them away from their neighbors and leave them alone with the one sound no one else wished to hear: the relentless backward tick echoing through their walls. When the whispers of neighbors grew too loud, the Caraways found themselves caught in a struggle larger than their family. In a town where faith ruled more firmly than law, there was one authority that overshadowed even though mass clocks, the church, and it was there that the ticking watch, though never carried through its doors, became the subject of sermons and warnings, shaping the family's fate in ways no mechanism could. Father Elias was not a cruel man, but he was uncompromising. He had served the town for nearly 3 decades, a figure of stern morality whose words held the weight of divine judgment. For him every event was filtered through scripture. When illness struck, it was a test; when harvest failed, it was a lesson; and when neighbors began whispering of backward hours and strange rhythms on Caraway Hill, he saw it not as coincidence nor as gossip, but as corruption. Margaret was the first of the family to feel the full force of his suspicion. Attending Sunday service with Anna, she noticed the sermon shift from parables of patience to warnings of false idols. Father Elias spoke of objects that defy the order of creation and souls tempted to linger in hours not given by God. His eyes lingered too long on her pew. The congregation turned subtle at first, then with open certainty Margaret gripped Anna's hand tightly, her prayer book trembling. By the following week Elias visited their home. He stood at the doorway, tall and severe, his black coat dusted with the dirt of the hill. He asked to see the watch. Margaret hesitated, torn between obedience and dread, but Thomas, standing behind her, refused outright. His voice was calm but firm. "No priest dictates the measure of my work." Elias' jaw tightened. He warned that if the watch ticked against the natural order, it could not be permitted to remain. His words fell like a verdict. Margaret pleaded, With Thomas afterward, her faith had always been her refuge, and to defy Elias felt like tearing away the last shield against their growing fear. She begged him to surrender the watch, to place it in the Chich's hands, but Thomas would not. For him, yielding the watch meant yielding the very principles of his craft. If he admitted that one piece of metal and spring was beyond reason, then every clock he had ever built stood on fragile ground. Their disagreements split the household. At night Margaret prayed longer, whispering for protection, for forgiveness. Thomas retreated deeper into his workshop, surrounding himself with gears and faces as though immersing in his trade would restore the world to logic. Anna found herself between them, torn by loyalty, listening to her mother's trembling prayers while watching her father's trembling hands. Samuel, restless and curious, asked why God hated clocks, a question Margaret could not answer without weeping. The town's judgment soon grew harsher. Rumors shifted into warnings. Parents forbade their children from playing with Anna, and Samuel the baker refused Margaret's coin. Neighbors claimed they saw strange lights flickering in the caraway windows during the night, though none had approached close enough to know. Father Elias fanned the unease, urging his flock to turn from the contagion of corrupted hours. The caraways were no longer merely isolated, they were condemned. Inside the house the watch seemed to respond to the conflict. Its ticking grew louder on nights when arguments flared, on evenings when Margaret begged Thomas to surrender it. The rhythm quickened as though mocking her desperation. When Thomas raged against the priest's intrusion, the ticking slowed, heavy and deliberate, filling the room like a second heartbeat. Anna began to chart these changes, secretly scribbling notes in her hidden book. Mother crying faster, father shouting slower. The pattern chilled her, yet she could not look away. Margaret tried once in desperation to pray over the watch itself. Kneeling before the mantel, she laid her hands upon it, whispering scripture through tears. For a moment the ticking softened, fading almost to silence. Relief surged through her chest until the hands of the watch jerked violently, spinning backward faster than before. She screamed, pulling her hands away, convinced she had invited something darker by daring to confront it. The strain wore upon them all. Meals passed in silence. The children avoided the parlor where the watch lay. The once comforting glow of oil lamps seemed weaker, unable to banish the shadows, and yet despite the mounting fear Thomas remained immovable. It is not unholy, he muttered one night to Margaret, his eyes sunken, his voice nearly broken. It is simply misunderstood. But to Margaret misunderstanding was no comfort. To her it was sin, pure and simple. If God had ordered time to move forward, then to harbor a device that reversed it was to stand in defiance of heaven. Her faith told her they were no longer a family of ordinary believers, but a household marked by transgression. This was the division the watch created, not merely between hours and minutes, not between reason and mystery, but between a husband and wife, between faith and defiance. Each tick deepened the rift, each prayer unanswered, each explanation unsatisfied, left the caraways further adrift, and in that division the watch seemed to thrive. The watch's rebellion did not remain a sound alone. As autumn turned to winter, its rhythm began to seep into the very fabric of the caraway household. What was once a backward tick became something greater, an influence subtle at first but soon undeniable. It was as if the watch had grown dissatisfied with merely defying time. Now it sought to command it. Anna was the first to notice. She kept her secret journal hidden beneath the loose floorboard under her bed, filling it with sketches of the watch face and notes on its changing pulse. But soon she began writing about moments that repeated themselves. She described speaking to her brother about a game he invented, only to feel minutes later that the same conversation unfolded again, word for word. Samuel laughed at her insistence, but when it happened a third time in a single day his laughter faltered. It's like we're stuck, he whispered, unsettled by the echo. Margaret experienced it differently. Preparing bread one morning, she pulled the loaf from the oven, charred and black, and she scolded herself for distraction, then returned moments later to find the same loaf pale and soft as if it had never been baked at all. She screamed, her hands trembling as she tore into the bread with her fingers, finding it raw and sticky. She turned to Thomas, who stared at the unbaked loaf with a haunted expression. He had no explanation, only silence. Samuel was the most candid. As always he began, insisting entire days had been lost. We already had Thursday, he told his sister once, clutching her arm with wide eyes. It came and then it went, but now it's here again. At first Anna dismissed him, but when she awoke the next morning and found her journal entries identical to the day before, her heart clenched with dread. The handwriting was hers, the words precise, yet she could not remember writing them twice. Even Thomas, stubborn defender of reason, could not deny the intrusions. He sat for hours in his workshop disassembling the watch with trembling fingers, only to find it whole again on the mantel. By morning he tried locking it away in a drawer, but each dawn it returned to its place, ticking in its relentless reverse. He kept detailed notes of its dismantling, even hiding the parts across the room, but always the watch reassembled itself pristine, undoing his efforts as though the hours he had spent were erased. The family began to keep journals, each member desperate to prove their own perception, but the entries contradicted one another. Margaret's book told of 3 Sundays in 1 week. Anna's showed a missing day between the 12th and the 14th. Thomas' notes contained pages of careful diagrams, but dates shifted inexplicably. Numbers scrawled over and crossed out. Samuel's journal was the most troubling. His entries were written in a hand that looked older than his years, letters precise and rigid as if belonging to a boy far beyond 9. As the distortions deepened, the house itself seemed to participate. Lamps flickered without cause, shadows crawled in directions opposite the sun. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 13 times at midnight, though Thomas had not wound it in weeks. Margaret swore she saw frost forming on the windows during warm afternoons, only to melt away within minutes. The air thickened with a sense of distortion, as if every moment carried the residue of another that had come before, or worse, that had not yet happened. The children suffered most. Anna grew pale, her eyes shadowed by sleeplessness, her voice distant. She began predicting conversations before they occurred, speaking lines moments before her mother uttered them. Samuel became frantic, running through the house shouting that the walls were breathing the wrong way. He claimed to glimpse himself in mirrors, but older, taller, with a hollow look. He did not understand. Margaret struck the mirror with a cloth one evening, shattering it in desperation, terrified of what her son might see next. Margaret herself began to waver under the weight of faith. Her prayers no longer soothed her. Each whispered plea for deliverance was answered not by silence but by the watch's merciless rhythm. She confessed once to Anna in tears that she felt the family was not merely cursed but trapped, pulled into an hour that folded endlessly upon itself, consuming days like a beast devouring prey. Thomas, too afraid, he raged in his workshop, tearing apart clocks, smashing gears with his hammer as though destroying timepieces might restore order. Yet every dawn the shattered parts returned whole, his destruction undone. He began muttering to himself, speaking not of God but of patterns and loops. Phrases that made Margaret shudder. He still clung to the idea that reason could explain what they endured, but his devotion to logic now looked more like madness. The Caraway home had become a prison of time. Days blurred, moments repeated, meals spoiled and restored, nights stretched unnaturally long. The watches ticking no longer came from the mantel. Allanite reverberated through walls, through the floorboards, through their very bones. At times the family felt they were breathing in rhythm with it, their hearts pounding backward in their chests. And so the watch's rebellion escalated from a haunting to a dominion. It was no longer content to reverse seconds, it reached deeper, pulling at days, unraveling the family's lives hour by hour, memory by memory. They could not tell how long it had been since it began, weeks, months, the hour that 8 days had consumed their sense of time, leaving only the backward rhythm, constant, unyielding, inescapable. When a family finds themselves at war with something beyond comprehension, their first refuge is often faith, but when prayer fails they turn to reason. For Thomas Caraway, reason had always been his compass, and so he sought answers in the only place left to him, science. It began with sketches and measurements by candlelight. Thomas sat hunched over his desk, drawing the watch face, charting its hands as they moved backward. He filled page after page with diagrams, calculations and notations in the margins. He tracked when the watch slowed, when it accelerated, when its ticking seemed to ripple through the air like a stone thrown into still water. But the deeper he sank into study, the more the answers eluded him. His records contradicted themselves. One set of notes claimed the watch reversed 1 second every tick. Another, written just hours later, insisted it leapt backward 5. On yet another page, Thomas' own handwriting had been overwritten with a script that looked similar but not identical. As though some future or past version of himself had intruded, he stared at those entries in horror, unable to recall writing them. Margaret begged him to stop. She feared his obsession was feeding the very curse they endured. It wants you to look at it, she whispered one night, clutching his arm. It wants you to believe it has rules, but it doesn't. It wants to break you. Still Thomas pressed on. He corresponded with colleagues in Savannah and Augusta, disguising his questions as harmless inquiries about clock mechanics. He received polite replies, explanations of escapements and balance wheels, but none of it matched the defiance of the Caraway watch. When he described in one letter a mechanism that unwound time itself, the reply came terse and cold, a warning that such words bordered on lunacy. Desperate, Thomas sought help closer to home. He invited Dr. Elias Worthen, a physician known for his fascination with the intersection of medicine and natural philosophy. Worthen was skeptical but curious. He arrived with instruments of his own, magnifying lenses, weights and a stethoscope, and spent an evening listening to the watches beat. What he heard unsettled him. It is not mechanical, Worthen said quietly, setting the watch back on the mantel. The tick is too steady, too anatomical. It beats like a heart. Not a machine. The remark chilled Margaret to her bones. She made the sign of the cross, but Thomas brushed it aside, insisting Worthen was mistaken. Yet even he could not ignore how the watch seemed to pulse, its sound resonating not in the ears but in the chest, as if binding itself to the rhythm of the body. Worthen examined the children as well. Anna's pulse raced irregularly, then slowed to a crawl without reason. Samuel's eyes dilated and contracted in unnatural rhythm as though responding to an unseen pendulum. Worthen recommended rest, but his voice lacked conviction. He left that night with hurried steps, refusing to take payment, muttering that he wanted nothing more to do with a time that eats itself. Still unwilling to surrender, Thomas carried the watch to the home of Professor Aldous Griggs, a mathematician who had once lectured on celestial patterns and the mysteries of time measurement. Griggs handled the watch briefly, then pushed it away. "I do not study monsters," he said flatly. "And that is what you bring me?" he demanded Thomas leave at once. With each failed attempt Thomas grew more hollow. His notebooks multiplied, but so did his contradictions. On some pages he insisted the watch reversed only moments, on others entire hours. Sometimes he wrote that the watch was silent for days, though Margaret swore it never ceased its backward rhythm. When he returned to those pages he found the words shifted, diagrams altered, calculations rewritten in numbers he did not recall using. Anna once crept into his study and found a page that made her scream. In bold letters across the paper was a message written in Thomas' own hand: "You are too late." I already became him. Neither Thomas nor Margaret could explain it. The paper was burned in the hearth, but Anna never forgot the sight. By now Margaret's faith had withered. She begged her husband to throw the watch into the river, to bury it deep in the earth, to take it anywhere far from their home, but Thomas refused. His voice shook with conviction, almost desperation. "If it can be studied, it can be controlled. If it can be controlled, it can be undone." Yet with each night that passed the evidence grew clearer. Science was no anchor here. The rules that governed the Carraways were not the rules of the natural world. The watch defied measurement, logic, and every law Thomas tried to impose upon it. In the end his pursuit of reason only deepened the family's despair, for if science could not explain the watch, then what hope remained? Prayer had failed them, reason mocked them, and the watch ticked ever backward, laughing in the silence it left behind. The Carraway home, once a place of warmth and gathering, grew colder with every backward tick of the watch. Friends who once lingered over suppers now crossed the street to avoid the door. Neighbors whispered that Margaret had taken ill with a wasting disease, or that Thomas had gone mad from debts he would not admit. Yet beneath those convenient fictions lay something darker, the recognition, though none would voice it, that the family carried a shadow no community dared confront. By late autumn the Carraways found themselves alone. The church pew they had once filled with their children now sat empty, a silent gap in the congregation. Reverend Hughes visited once more, but after hearing the watch tick within the house he left abruptly, his lips pale, offering no blessing. Margaret pressed him for words, but he gave none. Thereafter no minister set foot on their threshold. Margaret's world shrank to the boundaries of their home. The children grew pale, restless, speaking of dreams in which the days reversed themselves like pages turned in the wrong direction. Anna complained of knowing events before they occurred, while Samuel muttered that he could not remember whether his playthings had already been broken or were yet to break. Their laughter vanished, replaced with the distant stares of children too young to be so haunted. The house itself reflected the decay. Curtains remained drawn, lamps burned at odd hours, and meals were left half-eaten on the table. Visitors who dared pass by at dusk reported the strange glow of candlelight even at dawn, as though the Carraways no longer obeyed the cycle of day and night. The rhythms of time within their walls had fractured. The family was caught in a pattern no outsider could endure. Thomas still clung to his notebooks, though his handwriting had grown jagged, as if written under trembling hands. Margaret rarely entered his study now, for each time she did she found more pages filled with contradictions. On one Thomas had written, "We have not yet endured this week." On another, "This hour is already gone." Margaret would leave in tears, unable to face the mind unraveling before her. Isolation deepened their suffering. Without community to confirm their sanity, the Carraways were left only with the echo of the watch's steady mocking beat. They stopped receiving letters. Deliveries of flour and salt ceased. Even their closest neighbors, the Sims family, sent word through a boy that they would no longer be able to trade milk or eggs. The boy ran away before Margaret could press him for a reason. Loneliness fed fear. Margaret began to hear noises in the house beyond, the ticking footsteps in empty rooms, voices repeating phrases she had spoken days earlier, and once the sound of Anna singing. Though the girl slept soundly in her bed, Samuel awoke screaming one night that he had seen his father enter the room twice, once walking forward, once backward, overlapping like a reflection in water. The children grew fearful of their own reflections. Anna refused to look into mirrors, claiming her reflection was slower than her movements, lagging behind as though reluctant to return her gaze. Samuel smashed the mirror in his room with a toy soldier, crying that it had winked at him when he had not moved at all. Thomas scolded him but said nothing further. The shards of glass were swept away, yet none in the house dared look into a mirror again as winter set in. Their isolation became total. Snow lay heavy across the fields and the Caraway home seemed entombed. Margaret confessed in her journal that she no longer knew which day was which. The children sometimes claimed Christmas had already come and gone, while Thomas insisted it was still weeks away. Their meals became irregular, their sleep fragmented. It seemed that the watch was pulling them further from the calendar. The rest of the world obeyed. One night, as Margaret rose to check on the children, she found the kitchen clock spinning backward in unison with the watch. Terrified, she shook Thomas awake, but when he came to look, the clock ticked forward again. Innocent as ever, his face hardened with denial, but Margaret knew what she had seen. She realized then that isolation was no longer merely social, it was temporal. They were being cut off not only from their neighbors but from the very flow of time itself. Margaret attempted once more to plead with Thomas. She begged him to take the watch into the woods, to bury it, to smash it against the stones of the riverbed. Her voice trembled as she confessed her fear that the family no longer belonged to the world outside their door, that they had already been forgotten, erased by the slow erosion of hours. Thomas, exhausted, only shook his head. If we destroy it, he whispered, what happens to us? Silence became their companion. Days stretched and collapsed in ways none could measure. Sometimes the sun seemed to rise twice, other times night refused to fall at all. The Caraways stopped marking their days. Margaret no longer stitched her calendar squares. The children stopped asking when visitors might return. Their world had shrunk to the walls of their home and the steady pitiless tick that carried them backward into the unknown. Isolation had begun as a punishment imposed by neighbors, but it ended as something far worse, a prison built by time itself, and within that prison the Caraways waited, listening as their lives were slowly unstitched thread by a watch that refused to let them belong to any moment but its own. By the spring thaw of 1873 the Caraway farmhouse stood as if abandoned, its shutters loose in the wind, its chimney cold for weeks at a time. What had once been a proud home on the edge of Millbrook became an object of unease, spoken of only in lowered voices. Farmers passing by with their wagons claimed the path near the property grew colder, the air stiffer, as though winter lingered longer around that plot of land. When Margaret Caraway finally appeared in town one morning, her figure startled the market crowd. She wore the same dress many remembered from a year prior, though it hung looser on her frame as though her body had thinned beneath it. Her eyes seemed to scan the square without recognition, her lips moving silently as though rehearsing words. When asked about Thomas or the children, she only said, they are here, they are always here, and then she walked away without buying a thing. Rumors spread quickly. Some said she was mad from grief, others whispered she had lost her mind to a curse. One woman claimed Margaret looked both older and younger in the same breath, as if two versions of her overlapped like the flicker of a lantern flame. A shopkeeper swore she paid with coins that bore dates impossible for the current year, yet none pressed her further for fear of catching whatever invisible sickness clung to her. The farmhouse itself became the subject of legends. Travelers spoke of hearing children's laughter inside, though no one had seen Anna or Samuel in months. Others claimed that lights burned at noon or that shutters opened and closed without wind. The boldest of local youths dared one another to run up the porch steps and touch the door. Those who tried said they felt a vibration in the wood like the faint ticking of a clock. Few ever returned. Twice by midsummer Thomas was seen only once. He appeared in the fields beyond the church carrying his notebook, staring up at the sky as though searching for patterns no one else could see. Witnesses said he looked aged beyond his years, his hair grayed, his beard untrimmed. One boy swore Thomas disappeared behind a grove of pines and re-emerged moments later from the opposite side as if he had crossed space in an instant. When the villagers rushed to follow, they found nothing but the whisper of leaves. The town began to treat the Caraway place as cursed ground. Maps quietly omitted the road leading to it. The church made no mention of the family in prayer, and yet despite this silence stories thrived. They slipped between gossip and cautionary tale told around hearths in the evening. When the wind howled, some claimed that Margaret was seen walking backward along the riverbank at dusk, her feet leaving prints in reverse. Others believed the children were heard calling out to travelers, their voices echoing from different years so that the answers never quite matched the questions. A hunter swore he saw Anna in the woods holding the silver watch, though she should have been far too young to hold such weight. When he blinked she was gone, and only the faint ticking remained. What became of the Caraways? No single Account can say some insisted the family perished in winter's cold, their bodies unburied within the house, others believed they lived on suspended in a time no longer shared with the rest of Millbrook, still others claimed the house itself swallowed them brick by brick until they ceased to exist in the ordinary sense, but all agreed on one detail: the ticking did not stop for years after travelers who passed near the property reported hearing it, faint, yet undeniable, as though carried on the wind, a sound too regular to be mistaken for woodpecker, or dripping water too mechanical to be natural. It was said the ticking seeped into dreams, lodging itself in the ears of those who came too close, and when they awoke they found their clocks at home. Inexplicably behind folklore grew around these fragments. Some mothers warned their children not to wander near the old caraway path lest time itself come unstitched around them. Others whispered of bargains with forces unseen, that the watch was never crafted by human hands but had been placed in the river to be discovered, a trap waiting for the curious. Skeptics too found their place in the tale, insisting it was nothing more than isolation madness and the fevered invention of neighbors. Yet even skeptics admitted they would not spend a night in that farmhouse, not for all the money in the county. As years folded into decades, the caraway story became both less and more than history. Records showed no burials, no final estate settlements. Land deeds were transferred quietly, yet no one dared build upon the ground. The house itself sagged, its roof caving in, but no one raised a hand to tear it down. It was left to rot as though the very wood held memories no one wished to disturb. Children of Millbrook grew up hearing the whispers, repeating them as warnings. During games farmers crossed themselves when their horses slowed near the lane. Even into the new century, when trains and telegraphs tied distant places together, the caraway legend endured, stubborn as the tick of a clock that refused to die. And so in whispered tones the aftermath of the caraways became not a closed chapter but a cautionary echo. The watch that ticked in reverse had claimed not just a family but a portion of the town's memory itself, leaving behind a silence filled only with rumor, dread, and the sense that somewhere, somehow, a rhythm still counted backward. The caraway family and the watch that consumed them became a puzzle for generations. Scholars, chroniclers, and curious travelers have all attempted to explain the events that unfolded on that hill, yet none have reached a conclusion that satisfies both reason and imagination. Over decades a range of theories emerged, each offering fragments of understanding, yet all leaving a residue of unease that no calculation could erase. The first line of thought was mechanical. Clockmakers and mathematicians examined the fragments of descriptions left behind, attempting to reconstruct Thomas Caraway's design. Some argued that he had invented a timepiece so complex that its escapement mechanism combined with magnetic and gravitational anomalies of the hill produced an illusion of reversed motion. According to this view, the perception of backward hours and vanished days was a psychological echo amplified by isolation and anxiety. Yet even the most meticulous reconstructions failed to replicate the effect. When modern horologists attempted to recreate Caraway's principles, the watch's movement could only go forward, as all clocks must. A second, more metaphysical theory suggested that the watch acted as a conduit bridging the natural world with temporal anomalies. Paranormal investigators, fascinated by reports of repeated events and reversed motions, argued that the Caraway home became a pocket outside ordinary time. Margaret's journal entries, Samuel and Anna's observations, and the stories of townsfolk became evidence, they claimed, of a temporal distortion so complete that the family itself was trapped in a loop. Critics of this theory scoffed at the lack of physical proof, yet none could deny the eerie consistencies in witness accounts across years. Some historians have approached the Caraway case as a social phenomenon. They argue that isolation, fear, and community judgment created a collective psychosis, magnifying ordinary oddities into legend. According to this interpretation, the backward ticking watch was never more than a clever mechanical novelty amplified by superstition, stress, and the power of narrative. Marginal notes, missing journal pages, and conflicting accounts were seen as symptoms of human error and emotional strain rather than proof of altered chronology. Still, these explanations fail to account for reports of the ticking sound in empty rooms or for the strange optical phenomena described by observers, such as shadows moving counter to sunlight. A fourth theory emerges from folklore itself. Among local storytellers there exists a tale that the watch was no invention at all but a gift, or perhaps a curse left by a wandering clockmaker who had struck a bargain with forces beyond understanding. In these accounts the timepiece is an agent, a living object with will choosing its own moments to alter and consuming days for reasons unknown. This interpretation leans less on logic than on narrative, yet it resonates with the rhythm of events as remembered by Millbrook townsfolk. The repeated conversations, the vanishing moments, the glimpses of children both young and older. At once scientific curiosity and folklore occasionally intersect. Researchers using modern Instruments photography, seismographs and audio recording have attempted to verify historical accounts exploring the hill for magnetic anomalies, acoustic disturbances and atmospheric peculiarities, while some have recorded strange electromagnetic readings or low-frequency vibrations. No experiment has definitively linked these to temporal reversal. Still, these findings give a haunting legitimacy to accounts that might otherwise be dismissed, hinting that the legend may have roots in phenomena science has yet to fully understand. Psychologists have also examined the Caraway story, using it as a case study in collective trauma. They suggest that extreme isolation combined with persistent rumors and societal pressure can warp perception, producing hallucinations and memory inconsistencies. Children especially are susceptible. Anna and Samuel's experiences repeating events, glimpses of themselves older or younger, could reflect the human brain's struggle to process anxiety and repetitive stress. Yet even these analyses admit a troubling element: townsfolk independently reported phenomena beyond the family's private experience. How could fear alone generate sounds and lights beyond their home? Across these interpretations, one detail persists: the ticking. All accounts emphasize the same ceaseless backward pulse. It is described as mechanical and yet alive, a rhythm that seemed to resist human measurement. Time itself became subordinate to it, drawing the Caraways into a cadence that they could neither halt nor escape. Margaret's journal, the children's notes, even letters left unmailed, all speak to the same haunting persistence. No theory, whether mechanical, metaphysical, social or psychological, fully accounts for this single terrifying constant. Modern writers have explored the symbolic implications. Some propose that the watch represents humanity's fragile grasp on time, memory and legacy. Others see it as a metaphor for isolation's corrosive effect. Once a family is removed from community and denied understanding, the very measure of their lives can slip away. The narrative resonates because it is universal. Everyone ages, observes and measures, yet no one can control time itself. The Caraways' tragedy is a magnified version of this human condition, made tangible in the rhythmic tick that devoured days. Despite the mystery, some argue that fragments of hope remain. Margaret's brief appearances in town suggest resilience, or at least survival. Samuel and Anna, if still alive, may exist in a temporal loop inaccessible to ordinary observers, yet unbroken. The watch in this reading is both cage and lifeline. It isolates them from the world, but it also preserves them within a continuity only they inhabit. The idea is haunting and beautiful, a reminder that even in the darkest distortions some sense of continuity may survive. Today the Caraway farmhouse has long since fallen into ruin. Visitors report nothing more than wind through broken windows, scattered shingles and faint traces of the family's presence, yet the legend persists, circulating in whispers and journals and books about unexplained mysteries, and podcasts and documentaries exploring the edge where history meets enigma. Researchers debate, skeptics argue and storytellers embellish, but the core remains a family touched by something beyond measure, a device that ticked in reverse and a legacy no clock can undo. In the end the watch's tick remains unanswered, a metronome that challenges the certainty of all who hear it. Perhaps it is mechanical, perhaps magical, perhaps merely imagined, but it endures in the collective consciousness of those who dare recall the story. Time for the Caraways was no longer linear, no longer safe, and the echoes of their days reverberate still. And so the tale closes with uncertainty. Questions remain unanswerable yet compelling. Did the family survive? Did the watch stop, or does it continue to count backward in some hidden corner of existence? Does time itself hold secrets beyond measurement, or is the backward tick simply the invention of human perception pushed to its limits? Whatever the answer, the Caraway story endures. It reminds us that the ordinary can fracture, that family faith and reason can falter when confronted with forces beyond comprehension, and that sometimes the most terrifying legacy is a single persistent tick that refuses to stop. The watch that reversed time remains a symbol, a question and a whisper in the wind, carrying with it the weight of a family lost to the impossible yet never fully forgotten.